Okay, so there's one more thing I want you to remember about Abraham real quick, and then we're going to jump into Jacob and Esau. Now, remember Ishmael. Ishmael was born to Abraham by Hagar, and Hagar and Ishmael were sent away to the wilderness, right? Just like the Egyptian story. They were banished or sent away to the wilderness. Ishmael had 12 sons, right? And Ishmael was a wild man. His personality was he was an aggressor, right? And it calls him a wild donkey of a man. Just keep all that in mind. And remember, Hagar was what? An Egyptian. Just happened to be an Egyptian, which again is another hint, hint, wink, wink. Another hint toward Egypt again. Okay, so back to the Moses mystery, page 211. And remember, we're comparing this to the Horus and Set, right? And the Osiris story. It says, Egyptians also seem to be confused about the identity of Set, with Egyptian myths giving him conflicting roles. In some sources, Set corresponds to Apophis, the serpent that attacks Re, the sun, at the end of each day. That's something that repeats often at the end of each day, right? Because these are references to the sun. Because all these characters represent things. Okay? They're not talking about actual characters. It says, for this reason, Greeks identify Set with Typhon, a monster serpent from Greek mythology. Other sources portray Set as a mighty warrior who defends Re against Apophis. And Typhon we'll get into later, but remember that name too, Typhon. Okay? That's going to come back later when we deal with the astrology aspect of it. That'll be in another video. But remember that name, Typhon. Okay, so keep that in mind. And before we get into the Jacob and Esau, I want to take a quick tangent. And we're going to look at a popular bee goddess that the ancients dealt with. This website is called the Temple of Thiola. And it talks about this bee goddess. Bee like the insect. Yeah, the ancient Greeks and other people, other cultures that dealt with a bee goddess. Priests and priestesses dressed as bees to worship the divine bee goddess in ancient Sumer, for example. Priestesses dressed as bees, and in Minoan, Crete, 4,000 years later, the goddess and her priestesses dressed as bees. In these two other countries, Sirius was explicitly the star of the goddess, dealing with the great star Sirius. Inanna in Sumeria, and Isis in Egypt, in parentheses. It can be associated with that. And Minoan temple palaces in Crete were oriented to this star. It says the rising of Sirius ended a 40-day ritual. A 40-day ritual during which honey was gathered from the hives of the bees, and the honey was fermented, and people were made drunk, and different things, different rites, different rituals. And some of these bee maidens or priestesses, they taught divination. It says these sacred bee maidens, with their gift of prophecy, were to be Apollo's gift to Hermes, the god who alone could lead the souls of the dead out of life and sometimes back again. There's that death and rebirth again, right? The priestesses of historical descendants of the ancient bee goddess Demeter, Rhea, Sybil, were called Melissae. This is where you get the word Melissa, the ancient Latin word for bees. This is why you have the queen bee concept. You have all these people in Hollywood like Beyonce dressing like bees, right? This is where it comes from. People think it has to do with her name because it's B, starts with a B. No, it has to do with this. This is what they're dealing with. This is why you have a lot of people in Hollywood dealing with Kabbalah and things like that. Bees also represent birth, death, and reincarnation. And what they're pointing to or referring to with these traditions is the divine feminine principle. Okay, now, going back to the book Did Moses Exist, page 139. Honey, it should be noted, was a substance of resurrection magic, with the dead embalmed in it and ready for rebirth. In this regard, independent scholar of mythology Barbara G. Walker relates, myths presented many symbolic assurances that the goddess would restore life to the dead through her magic bee balm. Worshippers of Demeter called her the pure mother bee. Elsewhere, Walker states, Queen Bee, a ruler of Israel in the matriarchal period, bearing the same name as the goddess incarnate in early Mycenaean and Anatolian rulers as the pure mother bee. Deborah lived under a sacred palm tree that also bore her name and was identified with the maternal tree of life, like Zekum, the tree of Ishtar. The Bible calls her a prophetess or judge to disguise the fact that she was one of the governing matriarchs of a former age. This is Judges 4 and 4. So this is, when you look at Deborah, this is a female leader, right? Like a queen bee. Divine feminine principle again, right? Lived under a palm tree. Same thing as the bee goddess. And that's what Deborah means in Hebrew. It means bee. Remember the 40-day ritual? It also says in Judges 5, it says there was peace for 40 years. In other words, she ruled 40 years. Now, remember how I said I used to think that a lot of things could be copied from the Bible rather than by the Bible. A lot of things might be similar in the ancient pagan world because they had understanding of the truth. It's just distorted, right? But this is the thing about that doesn't add up to me anymore. Things like this. If that's the case, that the people that came up with this bee goddess was basing it on a real person named Deborah, then why would they not mention, and why would not any of the ancients mention that it came from a real person? And they have no historical documentation of this person. They just have the myth. Why would they do that? And if it is based on a real person, then why is it when they wrote this story of Deborah, why isn't that they didn't tell us that there was also a mythology attached to Deborah, so people wouldn't get confused? At some point you have to make a decision that either this thing was copied from mythology or it just plain doesn't make sense. That's the way I look at it now. It doesn't add up to be something that's just similar or copied from the Bible. The story in the Bible has to be the myth itself. It's directly based on mythology. And it's based on other things. These myths are dealing with principles and other concepts, not the literal story. This is why the stories repeat. And we're going to see that with Jacob and Esau. They repeat. So keep all this in mind. You got the tree. You got the 40 years, right? It's matching up with the bee goddess. And her name is Bee. She's a female leader, just like the queen bee, right? Feminine principle, the queen bee, mother bee. We got all that. Keep that in mind from when we go into Jacob and Esau. Now we're going to go back. Now it continues. It says one of Deborah's alternate names was Jael, the goddess Jah, possibly the same one patriarchal Persians called Jahi, the whore, an earlier feminine form of Yahweh. Writing about Jael, Judges 4 and 22, Walker further states, wild she-goat alternative name for the Israelite queen Deborah as a mate of the scapegoat god Baal god or Pan, Jael was the same as the Persians' primal goddess Jahi, adopted by tribal queens of the pre-patriarchal period. So basically you have, in the same place you have the story of Deborah, you have another female hero, right? Which also points us back to a myth. It says Jael sacrificed Sisera in a strange way, nailing his head to the ground. This is in Judges 4 and 21. Right? Another Bible story. It says, which may be likened to the priestess of Artemis Tauropolis, nailing the heads of their victims to crosses. Jahi the whore. Jael comes from a goddess concept, like the bee goddess. That concept already existed, but you have the same story in the Bible. So like I was saying before about the whole repetitive nature of things in the Bible, which we're going to see more with Jacob and Esau, what they're really trying to get through to us, it's not that it's the writers were not trying to tell us that something historical happened more than one time. They're not emphasizing a historical event, they're emphasizing an idea. They're trying to bring home the concept of a particular myth or belief of a more ancient time. So back to Jacob and Esau, page 220. This is the Moses mystery concerning the Osiris story and Set again, right? And dealing with the Genesis characters. It says, therefore, the role of Set had to be divided between two different people in Genesis, Ishmael and Esau. I told you to keep your mind focused on Ishmael for a minute. I said, remember Ishmael, because he has a lot of similarities with Esau. That's done on purpose. Remember, I told you there's a purpose behind the repetitive nature of these stories, because they're pointing to the same myth. To accommodate the two Set characters in Genesis, the roles of the three Horus deities have also been distributed between two Genesis characters, Jacob and Isaac. Now it says Jacob and Esau were the twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah. It says they did not get along and struggled even in the womb. And it says Esau forced his way out first, and Jacob unsuccessfully tried to stop him by grabbing at his brother's heel. Now we're going to stop here and we're going to look at something from Zoroastrianism. And this whole concept of the twins being born, one forcing his way out first, that comes from a myth. That's dealing with Ahura Mazda. We're dealing with Persian mythology now. In the book Myths and Legends, page 21, it says, when it was time for the twins to be born, Zervan promised that his firstborn should rule the world. Ahura Mazda, who was gifted with foresight, told his brother this. An evil-hearted Ahriman forced his way out first and lied to his parent, saying, I am your son, Ahura Mazda. So you got the lying about who he is. That concept was there too. Saying, I am your son, Ahura Mazda. But Zervan was not deceived and answered, my son is light and fragrant, but you are dark and stinking. And Zervan wept. The stories in the Bible are bringing home these type of concepts. Now remember, now pay attention to it. It says, my son is light, but you are dark. So we're dealing with dark and light. Same type of solar qualities that we dealt with Egypt, right? Horus and Set. Osiris. And if you look up Ahura Mazda, it says the literal meaning of the word Ahura is mighty and or Lord, and Mazda is wisdom. Back to the Moses mystery dealing with Jacob and Esau. Now look, we know the birth of Jacob and Esau. This is page 221. It says, at birth, Esau came out red all over like a hairy garment. As he grew up, he became a cunning hunter, and he became Isaac's favorite son because of his ability to provide his father with tasty meat. By virtue of his status as firstborn, Esau should have been heir to the covenant with God and leader of the Hebrew people. Instead, Jacob, with the help of Rebekah, tricked Isaac into giving him the birthright. Now it says the older brother wants to succeed to the leadership. The head of the family supports the older brother's claim. The younger brother, aided by his mother's trickery, obtains the right to rule. The mother, fearing for the younger brother's safety, hides him away from the other brother. And eventually the other brother makes peace with the younger brother and acknowledges his role as leader. This storyline, as we shall soon see, closely parallels the account in the contendings of Horus and Set. The birth of Esau also suggests a connection close to Egyptian sources. According to Genesis, Esau forced his way out of the womb and came out with red hair, so thick it was like a garment. According to Plutarch, Set, too, forced his way to an early birth, coming into the world, being born neither at the proper time nor by the proper place, by forcing his way through a wound which he had made in his mother's side. And the Egyptians also identified Set as red-haired. He was identified as a red-haired beast, which was often associated with the donkey. Remember what Ishmael was called? A wild donkey, right? Some ancient texts describe him as having a red mane, and Plutarch tells us that the Coptites threw an ass over a precipice because in its redness it resembled Set. So another hint. Why is Esau described with red hair? Because that's dealing with Set. That points you back to Set. The same character Ishmael had, and he was called a donkey. Keep going. It says, but Isis, this is in the Egyptian story, it says, Isis, look what she does. Disguises herself as an elderly woman and tells the ferryman that she has a bowl of porridge for the young man who has been tending cattle and is hungry. The ferryman is hesitant, saying that he has been forbidden to ferry women across. There's the bowl of porridge, just like with Jacob and Esau, right? Isis reminds him that the prescription was only against women looking like Isis. She then offers him a bribe and he takes her across. So you have that trickery, right? Remember the wife-sister scenario where someone's hiding his wife or disguising their wife, right? Saying it's my sister. That's a point to Isis. And Isis did what? She disguised herself. This is all to get her son to get the birthright, just like in Jacob and Esau. And just like in the story with Isis, she tried to get people to lust through her disguise, and that's what happened with the wives in the wife-sister scenarios. The kings lusted after her, even though she was in her disguise, right? Now it says in the traditional Horus Set story, after Set kills Osiris, Isis realizes that he also planned to kill Horus, so she hides her son away in order to protect him. In Genesis, we have a similar situation. When Isaac blesses Jacob instead of Esau, Esau threatens to kill the younger brother. Rebekah then arranges for him to be hidden away with her uncle. While the correlations aren't perfect, they are quite close. One difference is that at the time of the hiding, Horus is a child while Jacob is an adult. Another is that Set kills Horus's father, where Esau does not kill Isaac. Both events in the Egyptian story are related to the death of Osiris. But you can see that when Isaac was giving the blessing, he was about to die. So he was close to death. So you do have that in there. But anyway, it goes on. In the Egyptian myths, Isis is both wife and sister to Osiris and the mother of Horus. Set is the enemy of both her husband and her son and plans to kill both. He successfully murders Osiris, but due to Isis' protection, he fails in his efforts to kill Horus. Ultimately, Horus triumphs, and according to a number of Egyptian texts, he banishes Set to the desert areas outside of Egypt. The desert territory ruled by Set corresponds to the Bible's wilderness of Shur on the northeast corner of the Egyptian border. And it goes on. After Jacob fled from Canaan to Syria to avoid his brother's wrath, this is another side note here. It says Esau moved to the east side of the Jordan, where Genesis says he became the eponymous ancestor of the Edomites. But before establishing his claim to the territory, he first had to defeat a mysterious people known as the Horites. Now, the Horites were originally the allies of the god Horus in the struggles with Set. That's why there's always a big question about who were these Horites. That's where that comes from. The Horites were the allies of the god Horus in his struggles with Set. In later times, based on Set's red hairy body, the redactors simply identified him with the nation of Edom and moved him and his Horite enemies into that territory. Now, getting into the whole death rebirth, Jacob's name is changed to Israel, just like Abram's name was changed to Abraham, right? Repeating a concept. It says Genesis gives us two accounts of how Jacob changed his name to Israel. One incident occurred upon the occasion of Jacob's wrestling through the night with a stranger. The other happened in connection with Jacob's dream about a ladder to heaven. The two changes of Jacob's name correspond to the merger of the three Horus deities into a single personality. They're going to get into where that comes from. Also keep in mind the wrestling. Jacob wrestling with a stranger, it says, right? Remember, Jacob was trying to get away from Esau, but he has another meeting up with Esau in which he says, I have seen thy face as though I had seen the face of God, and thou wast pleased with me. Remember, Jacob says that to Esau, but look at when it happens. We're going to look at the sequence of this story closely and see what it's really dealing with. When it says, I've seen the face of God, the word used for that is Pineal or Pineal. Now it says, however, the identity of the stranger is suggested by the circumstances of the fight. A battle through the night in which the stranger cannot overcome his opponent. Now remember, we have one of those scenarios sort of like Genesis where it seems like there's two ways to go with it. Like one says it's God, one says it's the angel, and it's sort of ambiguous, right? That's done on purpose. It says a battle through the night. A battle through the night in which the stranger cannot overcome his opponent. Remember the dark and light? The overcoming of the sun and the setting of the sun. The sun being overcome by night, that type of thing. It says, as Egyptologists have generally noted, in the Old Kingdom pyramid texts, the battles between Set and Horus the Elder symbolized the battle between dark and light, night and day. That's why I said, keep in mind, it said that battle took place all the way through the night. It lasted through the night. And when you're thinking about a literal scenario, you got to be thinking about, does this really make sense as something literal? Do you really think Jacob wrestled with a spirit being all night? Is that something they're telling us literally happened? Or are they really trying to say something under the surface and give us a deeper message? Therefore, it is significant that Jacob's battle not only continued through the night and ended at daybreak, but at the conclusion, Jacob lifts up his eyes and suddenly Esau appears. So right after that, that's when he sees Esau and says that, I had seen God, I'd seen the face of God, right? The sudden appearance of Esau suggests that he was the stranger. That's why the scenario goes in that order, because it's suggested, it doesn't come out and say it, but it suggests that it's him because he sees him right after and says that. It says, in support of this view, recall how shortly thereafter Jacob says to Esau, I have seen thy face as though I had seen the face of God. Jacob's wrestling match is nothing more than a corrupted account of the original daily struggles between Set and Horus the Elder. But why did this lead to the name change from Jacob to Israel? A change of name suggests a form of rebirth. In Plutarch's story of Osiris, we note that after Set and Horus made peace, Osiris temporarily returned from the dead to father a child with Isis. This was Horus the child, and he was born lame in the leg. The laming of Jacob also occurs in the context of peace between Horus and Set. Initially, Jacob represents Horus, the son of Isis. When he wrestles with the stranger, he represents Horus, the elder. And you can see in the ancient world that whole concept of wrestling. That's not new. When peace arrives, he receives a new name, a rebirth, and in his lame condition becomes Horus the child. In describing the wrestling incident as a throwback to the earlier daily battles between Horus and Set, it's not literal. These things, they're giving you concepts. That's why it keeps happening over and over. They're trying to tell you something that the ancients believed, and it has nothing to do with literal people. And these concepts go deeper than just what's in the sky. They also have metaphysical meaning, biological meaning that deals directly with us. This is what the ancients were really talking about. The other scenario, as far as Jacob's name changing, the rebirth, right, was that ladder, Jacob's ladder. It says, he lighted upon a certain place and tarried there all night. This is page 232. This is what the Bible is talking about concerning Jacob. Because the sun was set, and he took of the stones of that place and put them for his pillows and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. This is what he saw in the dream, right? And behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham thy father, and the God of Isaac. The land wherein thou liest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed. So you have a ladder basically reaching to heaven, right? That Jacob saw in a dream. It says the image of a ladder to heaven has puzzled biblical scholars looking for Semitic antecedents for this concept. Some have tried to identify the ladder to heaven with the Babylonian ziggurats. Spicer, for example, finds it hard to imagine a steady stream of angels going up and down an ordinary ladder, and considers stairway a better translation than ladder. So basically, it makes more sense for it to be a stairway than like a literal ladder in the sense that we see a ladder today. Now you know what they're talking about when you hear people dealing with stairway to heaven. Like in the music industry, things like that. This is what they're dealing with. But what are they really talking about? Spicer concludes, only such a stairway can account for Jacob's later description of it as a gateway to heaven. But this was no ordinary ladder. To find its origin, we need to look no further than the Egyptian pyramid texts. Consider this example from the tomb of the 5th dynasty pharaoh Unas. Ra setteth upright the ladder for Osiris. Again, it says Ra setteth upright the ladder for Osiris, and Horus raiseth up the ladder for his father Osiris, when Osiris goeth to find his soul. One standeth on the one side, and the other standeth on the other, and unith is betwixt them. Eunice standeth up and is Horus. He sitteth down and he is Set. It says, or this from the pyramid of Pepi I, 6th dynasty. Hail. Now, this is another thing. Remember how they were confused about the whole concept of ladder, how that's not a good translation. Well, they're right about that, because if you look up ladder in Hebrew, it's kulam, or it's sulam, which means a staircase. If you go 551 or 5551 in the Hebrew concordance, in the Strongs, it's sulam. From 5549, a staircase. And that word kalal means to mound up, to exalt, to oppose, to cast up, or raise up. Remember how I said the language is going to reveal what it's really talking about. This is one of those examples. That's exactly how the Egyptians described Osiris. They raised up the ladder, right? Same thing. So again, I say, if it's really the Egyptians copying stuff from Israel in the Bible, then why is it that the writers of the Bible don't seem to know that? Why is it you have to look into it to see the connection? And why would the stories themselves match up with the myths that closely without any explanation? Now, if these were prophets of God, to me, I feel like they should have warned us that, hey, this story I'm giving you, this is what the Egyptians call Osiris. This is what the Egyptians call Set and Horus. They say it's this, but this is what it really is. They don't say that. You got to figure it out on your own. That lets me know that the writers were they're really giving hints, and they're really trying to show you that it's based on the myths. It can't be the other way around. It's not as simple as there was a Jacob and Esau, and that's where the Egyptians got it, and they based their gods after them. It's not that simple. I wanted to think that too, but it doesn't add up. For years, I wanted to think that. So anyway, okay, back to 233. It says, Jacob's ladder dream comes straight out of Egyptian imagery. The Egyptian passages quoted come from funerary rituals. As the Eunice passage says, Osiris has to climb the ladder to find his soul. Osiris represents the deceased king, and it is the deceased king who will climb the ladder. The ladder itself consists of the bodies of the gods Horus and Set. Jacob's dream depicts the same ladder. He even recognizes that he stands at the gate to heaven in place of the deities. However, Genesis has angels, which also could be called gods in the Bible too, incidentally. But it goes on to say, as the gateway to heaven, Jacob renamed the city Bethel, house of God. Coincidentally, the Egyptians identified heaven with the goddess Hathor, whose name means house of Horus. That is where the sun lives. Thus, Bethel, as the gateway to heaven and the place where God lives, would be the Hebrew equivalent of the house of Horus, which coincides with Jacob's presence there as a Horus figure. If Jacob's ladder originated as a funerary image, then one should expect the dream to be associated with a death. But no death appears in the story. Or does it? Remember I said that name change represents death and rebirth, right? And if that's what this is supposed to be pointing us to, that type of concept, then why doesn't the story have a death? Well, it actually does. Like I said, they make changes in the story, but they leave enough for you to figure out it's talking about the original myth. So here's the death part to link you in to what, to remind you, link you in, hint you that it's really talking about death and rebirth. It says, however, when Jacob returned to Bethel and changed his name, a death occurred. Immediately before the name change, Genesis says that Deborah, nurse to Rebekah, died. That's why I went into the Deborah. Remember, that bee goddess, what did that represent with the honey and everything? Rebirth, reincarnation, death and rebirth. That's why they stuck that in there, to let you know. See, if you're already familiar with that, you can see this and see, okay, I see what it's talking about. There's your hint. It says also Jacob's name change symbolically represents both birth and death. The old king Jacob died and was replaced by the new king Israel. And there's no previous mention of Deborah. Just right there after all this happens, because it's connected. It says all we know about her comes from her obituary notice that she was Rebekah's nurse and died at the tree named Alan-Bakuth, which is in Hebrew means tree of weeping. There's that tree. Just like Deborah's palm tree. This is the bee goddess, divine feminine. The tree reminds us of the incident in the Plutarch story in which Isis finds the body of her dead husband, Osiris, in a tree trunk in the house of the king and queen of Byblos. Which is funny, that's where the word Bible comes from. That's where you would have found Osiris. Funny that you have a Bible. I wonder if that's why we have that name for the book called the Bible. I wonder, could it be because that's where we can find Osiris? I don't know. That's just me. Anyway, it says to be with her husband. Isis takes a job as nurse. Remember, Deborah was her nurse. To the royal couple's child. In the story, Isis tries to confer immortality on the child through ritual magic involving the passing of the child's body through fire. During the process, Isis transforms herself into a swallow and flits around the tree, bemoaning her fate. Tree of weeping. She becomes a swallow and flits around the tree, bemoaning her fate. The child never receives immortality because the queen accidentally discovers what Isis was doing, and the transformation ends. At about that point, Isis lets out a shriek that frightens one of the king's children to death. I told you this is a code. These things that we're reading in the Bible are not literal stories, they're codes. Tree of weeping. That's a code taking you back to Isis. In Plutarch's story, we have a nurse flying sadly about a tree that contains the dead body of Osiris. In Genesis, the nurse appears at the tree of weeping, but instead of Rebecca/Isis as the nurse, the role has been transferred to someone identified as Rebecca's nurse, and her appearance coincides with the transformation of Jacob into Israel. Now, another thing that's funny about this is in the story, in the contendings of Horus and Set, right after that part of the story, there's a rape that takes place. Now, in the Bible, you don't see Jacob getting raped or whatever, but as in Horus, like in the story, it would have been Horus. And if you continue in that story, that's what the next thing you read about would be a rape. But it's funny, in this scenario in the Bible, the very next thing that happens is a rape. Only it's not actually Jacob, but it is Jacob's daughter Dinah who gets raped. And it's funny, she's raped by Hamor. And that's the name of the Shechemite king, Hamor. And the meaning of his name is male ass. From its dun red, he ass. There's that donkey again. And the color red. Because that's who it's telling you about. That incident in the the contendings, it would have been Set that did that act. So they're still pointing you back to Set, just like with Esau, just like with Ishmael. In the Bible, it's Hamor, but you look up the name. That's why I say that language gives it away. Points you back to Set. Now remember when Jacob had the place where he said he saw the Lord was called Pineal. Like I said, these concepts, when you deal with the Egyptian gods, they're not people that just said, oh, okay, I'm going to make up a god with an eagle head or a donkey head and bow down to it. These were symbols that represented things of nature, elements, energies, vibrations, things like that. It's science, and this was their depiction of it through symbols. And when you look at some of these, you can get a deeper message, a deeper metaphysical message if you tie everything together and go beyond just the literal story. Like I said, we have something called a pineal gland. The pineal gland is identical to what people call the eye of Horus, the way it looks. You can tell what they're really dealing with. This is what the pineal gland does. This is just an overview of just information about what people say about it. The pineal gland was once dubbed the third eye, which originated for many reasons, ranging from its location deep in the center of the brain to its connection to light. Some regard it as the principal seat of the soul and the place in which all of our thoughts are formed. The pineal gland produces melatonin, which helps maintain circadian rhythm and regulate reproductive hormones. The pineal gland secretes a single hormone, melatonin. This simple hormone is special because its secretion is dictated by light. Researchers have determined this is the effect of the sun. This simple hormone is special because its secretion is dictated by light. Researchers have determined that melatonin has two primary functions in humans: to help control your circadian or biological rhythm and regulate certain reproductive hormones. Your circadian rhythm is a 24-hour biological cycle characterized by sleep-wake patterns. Remember, Jacob was asleep when he saw the ladder, right? Daylight and darkness. Characterized by sleep-wake patterns, daylight and darkness, it helps dictate your circadian rhythm. Light exposure stops the release of melatonin, and in turn, this helps control your circadian rhythms. This is the deep meaning is it's really telling you about yourself. Melatonin secretion is low during the daylight hours and high during dark periods. This is what gives us the subconscious awareness in the mind. Like we could be asleep with our eyes closed, but you still, while you're sleeping, you still can seem to hear or see things. That's due to your pineal gland. And it's a connection to the spirit world or the another reality, an alternative spiritual reality. So again, we're dealing with energies, and this is some of the things that they were talking about when they represent by different gods. You know, they represent different energies or vibrations or whatever. Um, just like when you deal with the old Negro spirituals, right? That's kind of how mythology and some of the things in the Bible works as well. It's really telling you something. The message in, like, let's say that song "Wade in the Water," right? Somebody might look at that song and be like, "Oh, that's a nice song about God and waiting on God to save you." But those of us that would be keen to the inside information of what it's really talking about, it's really talking about something you have to do. And the slaves knew that was a code. That means I have to actually, it's talking about me. I have to actually go and go into the water so the dogs can't get me on the way to the north. And that's why it's talking about, as far as Jacob, a spiritual or a death and rebirth. It's really dealing with our spiritual death and rebirth, how we can be reborn. This is the message. Remember how it describes Jacob's ladder, and the image that we get is a ladder, right? Well, I think that's supposed to, that's on purpose, because if you look at this image, it sort of does look like a ladder, doesn't it? And I was looking at this like, wait, I wonder if this is the same type of thing it's talking about. And it's funny, it's like a pillar-like symbol that you can see in hieroglyphics. It's associated with the creator god Ptah and Osiris, the Egyptian god of the afterlife, the underworld, and the dead, and is commonly understood to represent his spine. And if you look at it, the way the Egyptians depicted it, it looks like a spine. This is what they're really dealing with. This is also why they dealt with the image of the serpent a lot, or the snake, because snakes represented rebirth. It wasn't something, oh, it's evil and satanic and dangerous. That wasn't the way they looked at it. Snakes shed their skin, and it's like they're reborn again. And this is why you see it on the forehead, where the third eye is on a lot of the Egyptian pharaohs or whatnot, because they're dealing with that pineal gland. You're dealing with the mind. This is Crystal Links about the Jed. The Jed symbol is one of the more ancient and commonly found symbols in Egyptian mythology. It's a pillar-like symbol representing, it's in hieroglyphics, representing stability. Stability. It's associated with Osiris, the Egyptian god of the afterlife and the underworld and the dead. It's commonly understood to represent his spine. You can get deeper in this. I'm just kind of touching on it, just let you know what some of this stuff is really talking about. The Jed is also known as the Tree of Life. So you see in the Babylonian pictures of the Tree of Life, this is what they're talking about. That Jed, or that ladder, right? But they're dealing with our own anatomy or physiology. It's actually a phallic symbol, the Jed. It's a ceremonial raising of the Jed, raising of that ladder, right? Just like in with Jacob, it was enacted as a festival of renewal and fertility, ensuring a bountiful harvest and the appeasement of the gods. It is comparable to the Sumerian counterpart of the Timen, or temple. This is also like the way you have in the New Testament talking about the body is the temple. The kingdom is within you. All that type of stuff are hints toward these concepts. It is generally hypothesized the prefix DJ and Djed equates to serpent and wisdom. Remember how I talked about the serpent imagery? See, the raising Jed, it's really talking about, another way to look at it is raising consciousness. As far as what all this means, it says the Jed was considered necessary to aid in the transformation of the physical body into its spiritual form of consciousness and light. This is the rebirth that they're all pointing to. This is where you get the term Kundalini. The common belief was that semen was reproduced in the spinal fluids. That's what's significant about the spine. People talk about, oh, it's phallic worship and all this type of stuff. They're dealing with science and the way we're composed. Hence the worship of the erect spine as a symbol of cosmic regeneration. This practice continued on with the Hindu traditions of Kundalini enlightenment and awakening the fire serpent, which resides in the chakras. And it goes further. Another concept is creation begins as vibrating sounds, lights, and colors emanating from a pulsating orb we refer to as consciousness or source. It says 12 spiraling cones, horns, tones, harmonics, burst forth, forming a circle around the source consciousness, connecting with it and each other to create endless grid programs of experience following a geometric blueprint we call sacred geometry. You have those 12 vibrations. This is why you also have the 12 signs of the zodiac. In other words, that energy, remember we're talking about the pineal gland at the top of that spine, right? In our mind, that's the top of the spine. This is why you have the 12, those 12 vibrations, like in a circle design. And this is why you have the Egyptians using the symbol of the lotus flower, because those 12 vibrations looks just like the lotus flower. When they're dealing with the lotus flower, like just like Buddhism and all that, Hinduism, this is what they're really symbolizing. This is what they're really pointing to. So that Kundalini, what does that word mean? Remember I mentioned that, Kundalini? That word means coiled one, like a serpent. That's why you see the images of the snakes going around that image, or the we're dealing with that whole the spine and the energy that transmits through it. That's why you have the symbol of those snakes. Like when you go to the hospital, you see the two snakes wrapped around the rod. That's what we're dealing with. It describes the concept of Kundalini as the figure of a coiled female serpent, a serpent goddess, not a gross but subtle substance, which is to be thought of as residing in a torpid. Again, that points you back to Lilith. They connect Lilith to the lower energy at the base of the spine. A serpent goddess, not of gross but subtle substance, which is to be thought of as residing in a torpid, slumbering state in a subtle center, the first of the seven, near the base of the spine. The aim of yoga then being to rouse this serpent, lift her head, and bring her up a subtle nerve or channel of the spine to the so-called thousand-plated lotus of the crown of the head, where the pineal is. She, rising from the lowest to the highest lotus center, will pass through and wake the five brethren, and wake the five between, and with each waking, the psychology and personality of the practitioner will be altogether fundamentally transformed. This is the belief. The Kundalini awakening. The Kundalini experience is frequently reported to be a feeling of electric current running along the spine. So basically, you can get deeper into what this stuff is really talking about. It says, as ancient writers have said, it is the vital force of prana, which is spread over both the macrocosm, the entire universe, and the microcosm, the human body. Basically, that energy that orders the universe is the same energy and design that orders the human body, and it's the same cosmic energy. So underneath the literal stories of the Bible, you have other concepts that go way back, and this is just touching on a few things that some of those concepts actually are talking about. They're dealing with science and the way we're connected to the universe and how we're connected and things like that. When you're dealing with Jacob and his spiritual awakening, or even Osiris, you're really dealing with the way we are supposed to be reborn or awakened on a conscious level. In my next video, I'm going to deal with Moses. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to this. Feel free to post your thoughts on it, and I will see you next time.